Welcome back. We're still not on a regular schedule, but periodically you have to do something or else you'll, start to lose yourself. So what I thought I would do today is I've just almost finished this book called The Big Money. This is the third volume in John Dos Passos's USA trilogy, which dates from 1933 is when he published this. And what I'm going to read you is from the second volume, 1919, and it dates from 1932. So I'm thinking the first one, the 42nd parallel, is probably from 29 or 30. So that's a very interesting time period. There were a lot of changes going on in the United States. The Republicans were going out. The Communists were coming in. In certain other Central European countries, there was sort of an opposite flow that was going on, in which a bunch of communists were being pushed out of various places, and some people who were rather better than Republicans were coming in. But at any rate, this is a very interesting time in history. It's interesting to see what kind of fiction was being written then, especially by, as I've claimed, I think Dos Passos, if you can see that little photo of him, he's like a half Anglo, half Portuguese guy. I think he was one of us. I sort of think that in his later years he might have become a neoconservative. He was definitely on the left in his youth. But as I've read in this book, The Big Money, and then researching some of the historical circumstances that inspired him to write that book, it's almost like in many circumstances in the teens and 20s, the left and right as they're currently constituted were actually merged together. In that elements of what we would consider to be left or right were merged. And so in the labor unions, you would have, basically Marxists and then white National Socialists arm in arm, constituting different tendencies within that, but both working against who on the other side? Capitalists, owners, bankers, financiers, and, entrenched political toadies and dogs' bodies of those types of people. And who do you find on both sides? You find certain, Chosenites and tribespeople, and then you find whites, of course, on both sides. So it's a very different political environment, of course, when essentially only whites or people who look like whites are politically enfranchised. And so now things have changed a lot based on the demographics and opening up through the cultural Marxist revolution of the 1960s. So it's just interesting to read about an America that's fundamentally different in its political orientations. Now, what I'm going to read to you here is a section called The House of Morgan, and that's why I've got these pictures of these guys from the J.P. Morgan family up here. And if you don't know anything about the Morgans, and if you don't know anything about the history of banking and high finance in the United States at least, I would recommend whatever the most recent version is, probably dating to the 1990s, of Eustace Mullins. He wrote a book originally called either Mullins on the Federal Reserve or Secrets of the Federal Reserve or something like that. But I'm sure you can get it off archive.org for free. And actually Alex Linder recorded an audio book of that thing as well. And so that's probably the best introduction to the subject that I've come across at any rate. You could read that book, G. Edward Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is quite good, but it's gone through so many editions, and every edition tacks on a new subject to the central core idea of the book, that it eventually just becomes like a universal history of America, and that becomes eventually less useful, especially because G. Edward Griffin plagiarized Eustace Mullins and cited him once in the book for some stupid minor thing. So that's really, of low character and low morals. And so that book is interesting but less useful. I've read that one too. Okay, The House of Morgan, although I would prefer the formulation from Dune where we call it House Morgan or House Rothschild rather than the House of Morgan. But I commit my soul into the hands of my Savior. wrote John Pierpont Morgan in his will, in full confidence that having redeemed it and washed it in his most precious blood, he will present it faultless before my heavenly Father. And I entreat my children to maintain and defend at all hazard and at any cost of personal sacrifice the blessed doctrine of complete atonement for sin through the blood of Jesus Christ, once offered, and through that alone. And into the hands of the house of Morgan, represented by his son, he committed, when he died in Rome in 1913, the control of the Morgan interests in New York, Paris, and London, 4 national banks, 3 trust companies, 3 life insurance companies, 10 railroad systems, 3 street railway companies, an express company, the International Mercantile Marine, power on the cantilever principle through interlocking directorates, over 18 other railroads, U.S. Steel, General Electric, American Tel and Tel, 5 major industries. The interwoven cables of the Morgan-Stillman-Baker combination held the credit up like a suspension bridge, 13% of the banking resources of the world. The first Morgan to make a pool was Joseph Morgan, a hotel keeper in Hartford, Connecticut, who organized stagecoach lines and brought up Aetna life insurance stock in a time of panic, and bought up Aetna life insurance stock in a time of panic caused by one of the big New York fires of the 1830s. His son Junius followed in his footsteps, first in the dry goods business and then as a partner to George Peabody, a Massachusetts banker who built up an enormous underwriting and mercantile business in London and became a friend of Queen Victoria. I would pause for just a moment. If you go read the book by Eustace Mullins, he will explain to you that George Peabody was a front for the London branch of the Rothschild family. That's where his operating capital came from. He was absolutely, unequivocally a front for those people. And then this is where the Morgans come from. They take over the Peabody business. And so unfortunately our friend Dos Passos either doesn't know this or doesn't tell us, but I have to tell you because otherwise you're not able to understand this. No one would be able to get this. And became a friend of Queen Victoria. Junius married the daughter of John Pierpont, a Boston preacher, poet, eccentric, and abolitionist. And their eldest son, John Pierpont Morgan, arrived in New York to make his fortune after being trained in England, going to school at Vevey, proving himself a crack mathematician at the University of Göttingen, a lanky, morose man of 20, just in time for the panic of 57. War and panics on the stock exchange, bankruptcies, war loans, and good growing weather for the House of Morgan. When the guns started booming at Fort Sumter, young Morgan turned some money over reselling condemned muskets to the U.S. Army and began to make himself felt in the gold room in downtown New York. There was more trading in gold than trading in muskets. There was more in trading in gold than in trading in muskets. So much for the Civil War. During the Franco-Prussian War, Junius Morgan floated a huge bond issue for the French government at Tours. At the same time, young Morgan was fighting Jay Cooke and the German Jew bankers in Frankfurt over the funding of the American war debt. He never did like the Germans or the Jews. The Panic of 75 ruined Jay Cooke and made J. Pierpont Morgan the boss croupier of Wall Street. He united with the Philadelphia Drexels and built the Drexel Building, where for 30 years he sat in his glassed-in office, red-faced and insolent, writing at his desk, smoking great black cigars, or, if important issues were involved, playing solitaire in his inner office. He was famous for few words, yes or no, and for his sudden way of blowing up in a visitor's face, and for that special gesture of the arm that meant, "What do I get out of it?" In 77, Junius Morgan retired. J. Pierpont made himself a member of the board of directors of the New York Central Railroad and launched the first Corsair. He liked yachting and to have pretty actresses call him Commodore. He founded the Lying-In Hospital on Stuyvesant Square and was fond of going into St. George's Church and singing a hymn all alone in the afternoon quiet. In the Panic of '93, at no inconsiderable profit to himself, Morgan saved the U.S. Treasury. Gold was draining out, the country was ruined, the farmers were howling for a silver standard. Grover Cleveland and his cabinet were walking up and down in the Blue Room at the White House without being able to come to a decision. In Congress, they were making speeches while the gold reserves melted in the sub-treasuries. Poor people were starving. Coxey's army was marching to Washington. For a long time, Grover Cleveland couldn't bring himself to call in the representative of the Wall Street money masters. Morgan sat in his suite at the Arlington smoking cigars and quietly playing solitaire until at last the president sent for him. He had a plan already for stopping the gold hemorrhage. After that, what Morgan said went. When Carnegie sold out, he bought the Steel Trust. J. Pierpont Morgan was a bull-necked, irascible man with small black magpie's eyes and a growth on his nose. He let his partners work themselves to death over the detailed routine of banking and sat in his back office smoking black cigars. When there was something to be decided, he said yes or no, or just turned his bank and went back to his solitaire. Every Christmas, his librarian read him Dickens' A Christmas Carol from the original manuscript. He was fond of canary birds and Pekingese dogs and liked to take pretty actresses yachting. Each Corsair was a finer vessel than the last. When he dined with King Edward, he sat at His Majesty's right. He ate with the Kaiser tete-a-tete. He liked talking to cardinals or the Pope, and never missed a conference of Episcopal bishops. Rome was his favorite city. He liked choice cookery and old wines and pretty women and yachting, and going over his collections, now and then picking up a jeweled snuff box and staring at it with his magpie's eyes. He made a collection of the autographs of the rulers of France, owned glass cases full of Babylonian tablets, seals, signets, statuettes, busts, Gallo-Roman bronzes, Merovingian jewels, miniatures, watches, tapestries, porcelains, cuneiform inscriptions, paintings by all the old masters, Dutch, Italian, Flemish, Spanish, manuscripts of the Gospels and the Apocalypse, a collection of the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the letters of Pliny the Younger. His collectors bought anything that was expensive or rare or had the glint of empire on it, and he had it brought to him and stared hard at it with his magpie's eyes. Then it was put in a glass case. The last year of his life he went up the Nile on a dahabiyah, and spent a long time staring at the great columns of the Temple of Karnak. The Panic of 1907 and the death of Harriman, his great opponent in railroad financing, in 1909, left him the undisputed ruler of Wall Street, most powerful private citizen in the world. An old man tired of the purple, suffering from gout, he had deigned to go to Washington to answer the questions of the Peugeot Committee during the Money Trust investigation. Yes, I did what seemed to me to be best for the interests of the country. So admirably was his empire built that his death in 1913 hardly caused a ripple in the exchanges of the world. The purple descended to his son, J.P. Morgan, who had been trained at Groton and Harvard and by associating with the British ruling class, to be a more constitutional monarch. J.P. Morgan suggests. By 1917, the Allies had borrowed $1,900,000,000 through the House of Morgan. We went overseas for democracy and the flag. And by the end of the peace conference, the phrase J.P. Morgan suggests had compulsion over a power of $74 billion. J.P. Morgan is a silent man, not given to public utterances, but during the Great Steel Strike, he wrote Gary, "Heartfelt congratulations on your stand for the open shop, with which I am, as you know, absolutely in accord. I believe American principles of liberty are deeply involved and must win if we stand firm." Wars and panics on the stock exchange, machine gun fire and arson, bankruptcies, war loans, starvation, lice, cholera, and typhus. Good growing weather for the House of Morgan. Let's do another one. Let's do William Randolph Hearst, and then this appears in The Big Money towards the end. And if you've ever seen Citizen Kane by Orson Welles, then you know a little bit about William Randolph Hearst. But this was written before that film ever was imagined. So let's see what he had to say. Let's see what Dos Passos thought. It's called Poor Little Rich Boy. William Randolph Hearst was an only son, the only chick in the richly feathered nest of George and Phoebe Hearst. In 1850, George Hearst had left his folks and the farm in Franklin County, Missouri, and had driven a team of oxen out to California. In 1949, the sudden enormous flare of gold had filled the West. The young men couldn't keep their minds on their plowing, on feeding the swill to the pigs, on threshing the wheat, when the fires of gold were sweeping the Pacific slope. Cholera followed in the ruts of the ox carts. They died of cholera around the campfires, in hastily built chinch-infested cabins. They were picked off by hostile Indians. They blew each other's heads off in brawls. George Hearst was one of the few that made it. Let me also mention that that is exactly the circumstances taking place in Blood Meridian. If you remember sort of the denouement toward the end at the Gila Ferry, the people that the Glanton gang are robbing and pillaging and plundering and despoliating, those are these people, right? These people who are headed out to California from the West. Blood Meridian takes place in 1848, 49, and 50, about in that range, and this is exactly what we're talking about here. So we already know something about George Hearst. George Hearst was one of the few that made it. He developed a knack for placer mining. As a prospector, he had an accurate eye for picking out a gold-bearing vein of quartz. After 7 years in El Dorado County, he was a millionaire. Anaconda was beginning. He owned 1/6 of the Ophir mine. He was in on the Comstock lode. In 1961, he went back home to Missouri with his pockets full of nuggets and married Phoebe Apperson and took her back by boat across Panama to San Francisco, the new hilly capital of the millionaire miners, and bought a mansion for her beside the Golden Gate on the huge fog-bound coast of the Pacific. He owned vast ranges and ranches, raised cattle, ran racehorses, prospected in Mexico, employed 5,000 men in his mines, on his estates, lost and won fortunes in mining deals, played poker at a century a chip, never went out without a bag of clinkers to hand out to old friends down on their uppers, and died in Washington, a senator, a rough diamond, a lusty, beloved, white-bearded old man with the big beak and sparrowhawk eyes of a breaker of trails, the beetling brows under the black slouch hat of an old-timer. Now, if any of this is to be believed, and we do have to trust some things in history or else we don't have anywhere to stand, then George Hearst is part of the American dream that a white man can get rich through the sweat of his brow, the intelligence of his mind, strength of his arm. So let's not hate George Hearst Let's not want to destroy him just because he became richer than Croesus. Next section. Mrs. Hearst boy was born in 63. Nothing. Mrs. Hearst's boy was born in 63. Nothing too good for the only son. The Hearsts doted on their boy. The big, lanky youngster grew up solemn-eyed and self-willed among servants and hired men, factotums, overseers, hangers-on, old pensioners. His grandparents spoiled him. He always did everything he wanted. Mrs. Hearst's boy must have the best of everything. No lack of gold nuggets, $20 gold pieces, big silver cartwheels. The boy had few playmates. He was too rich to get along with the others in the rough and tumble democracy of the boys growing up in San Francisco in those days. He was too timid and too arrogant. He wasn't liked. His mother could always rent playmates with ice cream, imported candies, expensive toys, ponies, fireworks, always ready to set off. The ones he could buy he despised. He hankered always after the others. He was great on practical jokes and pulling the leg of the grown-ups. When the new Palace Hotel was opened with a reception for General Grant, he and a friend had themselves a time throwing down handfuls of birdshot on the glass roof of the court, to the consternation of the bigwigs and stuffed shirts below. Wherever they went royally, the Hearsts could always buy their way. Up and down the California coasts, through ranches and mining towns, in Nevada and in Mexico, in the palace of Porfirio Diaz. The old man had lived in the world, had rubbed shoulders with rich and poor, had knocked around in miners' hells, had pushed his way through unblazed trails with a pack mule. All his life, Mrs. Hearst's boy was to hanker after that world. Hidden from him by a mist of millions, the boy had a brain, appetites, an imperious will, but he could never break away from the gilded apron strings. Adventure became slumming. He was sent to boarding school at St. Paul's in Concord, New Hampshire. His pranks kept the school at an uproar. He was fired. He tutored and went to Harvard, where he cut quite a swath as business manager of the Lampoon, a brilliant entertainer. He didn't drink much himself. He was soft-spoken and silent. He got the other boys drunk and paid the bills, bought the fireworks to celebrate Cleveland's election, hired the brass bands, bought the cream pies to throw at the actors from the box at the Old Howard, the cannon crackers to blow out the lamps of herdic cabs with, the champagne for the Corines. He was rusticated and finally fired from Harvard, so the story goes, for sending to each of a number of professors a chamber pot with the professor's portrait tastefully engraved on it. What a classy prank, right? He went to New York. He was crazy about newspapers. Already he'd been hanging around the Boston newspaper offices. In New York, he was taken by Pulitzer's newfangled journalism. He didn't want to write. He wanted to be a newspaper man. Newspapermen were a part of that sharp-contoured world he wanted to see clear. The real life he saw distorted by a haze of millions, the ungraded low-life world of American democracy. Mrs. Hearst's boy would be a newspaperman and a Democrat. Newspapermen saw, heard, ate, drank, touched, horsed, kid, rubbed shoulders with real men. Whored. That was life. He arrived home in California, a silent, soft, smiling, solemn-eyed young man, dressed in the height of the London fashion. When his father asked him what did he want to do with his life, he said he wanted to run the Examiner, which was a moribund sheet in San Francisco, which his father had taken over for a bad debt. It didn't seem much to ask. The old man couldn't imagine why Willie wanted the old rag instead of a mine or a ranch, but Mrs. Hearst's boy always had his way. Young Hearst went down to the Examiner one day and turned the office topsy-turvy. He had a knack for finding and using bright young men. He had a knack for using his own prurient hanker after the lusts and envies of plain, unmoneyed, low-life men and women. The slummer sees only the streetwalkers, the dope parlors, the strip acts, and goes back uptown saying he knows the working-class districts, the lowest common denominator. Sorry, we got to back up so we can carry this forward. The lowest common denominator, manure to grow a career in, the rot of democracy. See, this is what makes me think Dos Passos is one of our guys, right? He can appreciate the fact that George Hearst built his own fortune, that the son is trapped in that world, wants to have some sort of authentic experience, but can't, due perhaps to his own moral failings of being unable to cut those gilded apron strings, and ends up being someone who's slumming. Perhaps the bit of this is coming back on Dos Passos himself, because he came from a semi-privileged background, and this novel, The Big Money, this is tough stuff to read. This is definitely the darkest of the three. I could tell you guys some about that, but we'll continue with this. The lowest common denominator, manure to grow a career in, the rot of democracy. How does democracy rot, I ask? What is he thinking? We're talking about, 1890? Democracy's already rotten in 1890? What did we just hear from Morgan? Grover Cleveland had to call in the Wall Street money masters to save his bacon so that the entire American experiment didn't fall apart. And you got people in 2020 and 2021 saying that Joe Biden ended America? How long has this been going on? Out of it grew rankly an empire of print. Perhaps he liked to think of himself as the young Caius Julius flinging his millions away, tearing down emblems and traditions, making faces at togaed privilege, monopoly, stuffed shirts in office. Caesar's life, like his, was a millionaire prank. Perhaps W.R. had read of republics ruined before. Alcibiades, too, was a practical joker. The San Francisco Examiner grew in circulation, tickled the prurient hankers of the moneyless man, and became the monarch of the dailies. When the old man died, Mrs. Hearst sold out of Anaconda for $7.5 million. W.R. got the money from her to enter the New York field. He bought the Morning Journal and started his race with the Pulitzers as to who should cash in most on the gee whiz emotion. In politics, he was the People's Democrat. You hear that? That's a populist, right? The People's Democrat. He came out for Bryan in 96. On the coast, he fought the Southern Pacific and the utilities and the railroad lawyers who were grabbing the state of California away from the first settlers. On Election Day in 96, his 3 papers in New York put out between them more than 1.5 million copies, a record that forced the New York World to cut its price to a penny. When there's no news, make news. Just a second. I'm recovering from a pretty bad case of bronchitis, and so I'm having to take these pauses. This is actually the first day I've really been capable of speaking for an extended period of time without completely losing my breath. When there's no news, make news. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. He's supposed to have wired Remington in Havana. The trouble in Cuba was a gold mine for circulation when Mark Hanna had settled national politics by planting McKinley in the White House. Hearst had one of his bright young men engineer a jailbreak for Evangelina Cisneros, a fair Cuban revolutionist shoved into a dungeon by Viler, and put on a big reception for her in Madison Square. Remember the Maine. When McKinley was forced to declare war on Spain, W.R. had his plans all made to buy and sink a British steamer in the Suez Canal. But the Spanish fleet didn't take that route. He hired the Sylvia and the Buccaneer and went down to Cuba himself with a portable press and a fleet of tugs, and brandishing a six-shooter, went in with the longboat through the surf and captured 26 unarmed, half-drowned Spanish sailors on the beach and forced them to kneel and kiss the American flag in front of the camera. Manila Bay raised the circulation of the Morning Journal to 1,600,000. Do a false flag, right? I'd also like to point out that just here recently, I can't remember, I don't know, it was probably a month or two ago, Tim Kelly had a guy on Powers and Principalities or Our Interesting Times, and the guy had some good points, but he was like really like, I don't know how you could say, like blue-pilled or something, like really pathetic on mainstream history kind of stuff. And he was saying that the Germans sent these spies over here to America during World War I and blew up a bunch of stuff and did a bunch of sabotage in America, and that people didn't know about it. And I thought, this just sounds like more Allied British, American war propaganda against Germans from the first half of the 20th century, right? Sounds like nonsense. So I looked it up, and the two main incidences were these places where these ships, one in New Jersey and then one in California, maybe, I think, these ships were loaded with munitions or nitrates or nitrites, whatever they use to make munitions, either completed munitions or the explosive components that go into munitions. And the ships blew up while they were docked, killed some people, and basically just like a gigantic explosion occurring in a port. And this was blamed on the Germans, and they got some people to confess to it or whatever. And the funny thing was, in one of those cases, one of the guys who confessed to it, they just let him go at the end of the war. They didn't even, kill him or hold him in jail. They just said, okay, go ahead and go home back to Germany. So I think in my, it seems to me it's much easier to explain just by the stuff blew up as it used to. Sometimes you get ships that explode when they're carrying that kind of stuff because they're hot and they're crammed absolutely to the gills, and they generate heat, and that chain reaction goes off and they just explode. But anyhow, whatever happened with the Maine, right? It's the old thing about never let a disaster or an incident of any kind go to waste. But according to Dos Passos, William Randolph Hearst was perfectly happy to actually just do a straight-out false flag, buy and sink a British steamer in the Suez Canal, so that if the Spanish fleet was going through there, they would do that and then blame the destruction of that vessel on the Spanish and say that they had attacked the British. But the Spanish fleet didn't take that route. Okay. When the Spaniards were licked, there was nobody left to heckle but the Mormons. Polygamy titillated the strap hangers, and the sex lives of the rich. Pardon me. And pen and ink drawings of women in underclothes and prehistoric monsters in 4 colors. He discovered the Sob Sister, Annie Laurie, Dorothy Dix, Beatrice Fairfax. He splurged on comics. The Katzenjammer Kids, Buster Brown, Crazy Cat. Get excited when the public is excited. His editorials hammered at malefactors of great wealth, trusts, the GOP, Mark Hanna, and McKinley, so shrilly that when McKinley was assassinated, most Republicans in some way considered Hearst responsible for his death. Hearst retorted by renaming the Morning Journal the American and stepping into the limelight, wearing a black frock coat and a 10-gallon hat, presidential timber, the millionaire candidate of the common man. Bryan made him president of the National Association of Democratic Clubs and advised him to start a paper in Chicago. After Bryan's second defeat, Hearst lined up with Charles F. Murphy in New York and was elected to Congress. His headquarters were at the Holland House, The night of his election, he gave a big free show of fireworks in Madison Square Garden. A mortar exploded and killed or wounded something like 100 people. That was one piece of news the Hearst men made that wasn't spread out on the front pages of the Hearst papers. In the House of Representatives, he was unpopular. It was school days all over again. The limp handshake, the solemn eyes set close to the long nose, the small, flabby, scornful smile were out of place among the Washington backslappers. He was ill at ease without his hired gang around him. He was happier entertaining first-nighters and footlight favorites at the Holland House. In those years when Broadway still stopped at 42nd Street, Millicent Wilson was a dancer in The Girl from Paris. She and her sister did a sister act together. She won a popularity contest in the Morning Telegraph and the hand of William Randolph Hearst. Like showgirls, yeah? In 1904, he spent a lot of money putting his name up in electric lights at the Chicago Convention to land the Democratic nomination, but Judge Parker in Wall Street got it away from him. In 1905, he ran for mayor of New York on a municipal ownership ticket. In 1906, he very nearly got the governorship away from the solemn whiskered Hughes. There were Hearst for President clubs all over the country. He was making his way in politics, spending millions to the tune of "Waltz Me Around Again, Willie." He managed to get his competitor James Gordon Bennett up in court for running indecent ads in the New York Herald. Fined $25,000, a feat which hardly contributed to his popularity in certain quarters. In 1908, he was running revelations about Standard Oil. The arch bold letters that proved that the trusts were greasing the palms of the politicians in a big way. He was the candidate of the Independence Party, made up almost exclusively, so his enemies claimed, of Hearst employees. His fellow millionaires felt he was a traitor to his class, but when he was taxed with his treason, he answered, "You know I believe in property, and you know where I stand on personal fortunes. But isn't it better that I should represent in this country the dissatisfied than have someone else do it who might not have the same real property relations that I may have?" Consider that, guys. You hear that argument? He says, isn't it better for the populist to be a billionaire rather than let these people have a real populist who's from the people? Like a corporal? We certainly don't want a populist leader for the nation who's a corporal who actually fought on the front line and got the Iron Cross second class and first class, right? No. We want Hearst, okay, Donald J. Hearst, William Randolph Trump, who will represent the interest of his class while being the populist leader. Now, unfortunately, they didn't have Jonathan Pollard and Little Snoop and Big Wayne and all these other people to get pardons, or, certainly they could have gotten out of jail had William Randolph Trump or Donald J. Hearst been elected to president back in 1908 or whatever we're talking about here. Okay. By 1914, although he was the greatest newspaper owner in the country, the proprietor of hundreds of square miles of ranching and mining country in California and Mexico, his affairs were in such a scramble that he had trouble borrowing $1 million, and politically, he was rat poison. All the millions he signed away, all his skill at putting his own thoughts into the skull of the strap hanger, failed to bridge the tiny Rubicon between amateur and professional politics. Perhaps he could too easily forget a disappointment, buying a first-rate rider or an embroidered slipper attributed to Charlemagne, or the gilded bed a king's mistresses was supposed to have slept in. Sometimes he was high enough above the battle. Okay, get this is good. Sometimes he was high enough above the battle to see clear. He threw all the power of his papers, all his brilliance as a publisher into an effort to keep the country sane and neutral during the First World War. He opposed loans to the Allies, seconded Bryan in his lonely fight to keep the interests of the United States as a whole paramount over the interests of the Morgan banks and the Anglophile businessmen of the East. There's a certain J word that's missing here. Over the interest of the Morgan banks and the Anglophile businessmen of the East. It's true, the J's were pro-German at this time, but we're going to miss out on that switch that takes place. It's the most important part after Lord Balfour does his little business, his sordid prostitution. For his pains, he was razzed as a pro-German, and when war was declared, had police detectives among his butlers, Secret Service agents ransacking his private papers, gumshoeing round his dining room on Riverside Drive to investigate rumors of strange colored lights seen in his windows. He opposed the Peace of Versailles and the League of Victorious Nations, and ended by proving that he was as patriotic as anybody by coming out for conscription and printing his papers with red, white, and blue borders with little American flags at either end of the date line, and continually trying to stir up trouble across the Rio Grande and inflating the Yankee Doodle bogey, the biggest navy in the world. The people of New York backed him up by electing Hearst candidate for mayor, Honest John Hyland. But Al Smith, while he was still the sidewalk's hero, rapped Hearst's knuckles when he tried to climb back onto the Democratic sound truck. In spite of enormous expenditures on forged documents, he failed to bring about a war with Mexico. You guys know what we're talking about with that? We're talking about the famous Zimmerman telegram, where supposedly Germany is trying to get Mexico to attack America to open up another front. And this is being pinned on Hearst, millions on forged documents. In spite of spraying hundreds of thousands of dollars into movie studios, he failed to put over his favorite movie star as America's sweetheart. And more, the emperor of newsprint retired to his fief of San Simeon on the Pacific coast, where he assembled a zoo, continued to dabble in moving pictures, collected warehouses full of tapestries, Mexican saddles, bric-a-brac, china, brocade, embroidery, old chest of drawers, tables and chairs, the loot of dead Europe. Built an Andalusian palace and a Moorish banquet hall, and there spends his last years amid the relaxing adulations of screen stars, admin, screenwriters, publicity-men, columnists, millionaire editors, a monarch of that new El Dorado, where the warmed-over daydreams of all the ghettos are churned into an opiate haze, more scarily blinding to the moneyless man, more fruitful of millions than all the clinking multitude of double eagles, the older Hearst minted out of the El Dorado County in the old days. The empire of the printed word continues powerful by the inertia of bigness. But this power over the dreams of the adolescents of the world grows and poisons like a cancer. Do you hear that? The empire of the printed word continues powerful by the inertia of bigness. But this power over the dreams of the adolescents of the world grows and poisons like a cancer. Well, it sure is a shame that that's being pinned on Hearst rather than certain of Sigmund Freud's relatives who were at the ground floor of the advertising and marketing industries, wouldn't you say? And out of the West Coast haze comes now and then an old man's querulous voice, advocating the sales tax, hissing dirty names at the defenders of civil liberties for the working man. Jail the Reds! praising the comforts of Baden-Baden under the blood and bludgeon rule of handsome Adolf. Hearst's own loved invention, the lowest common denominator come to power out of the rot of democracy. Let's read that again. Jail the Reds, praising the comforts of Baden-Baden under the blood and bludgeon rule of handsome Adolf. This is 1933, right? Our good man, the little corporal, as he was derided, has finally come to power, and he's the Dutch cleanser, and he is sweeping all of the filth out of Germany, and that is the blood and bludgeon rule. So-called. Well, Dos Passos got it wrong there. Hearst's own loved invention, the lowest common denominator come to power out of the rot of democracy. Well, I mean, that's half right. A man of the people come to power out of the rot of democracy. So yeah, we're halfway there. It's populism. Complaining about the California income taxes, shrilling about the dangers of thought in the colleges. Deport! Jail! Until he dies. The magnificent, endlessly rolling presses will pour out print for him. The whirring everywhere projectors will spit images for him. A spent Caesar grown old with spending. Never man enough to cross the Rubicon. Let's do another one. Let's do St. Ford. Tin Lizzie. Mr. Ford, the automobilier, the feature writer wrote in 1900, Mr. Ford, the automobilier, began by giving his steed 3 or 4 sharp jerks with the lever at the right-hand side of the seat. That is, he pulled the lever up and down sharply in order, as he said, to mix air and gasoline and drive the charge into the exploding cylinder. Mr. Ford slipped a small electric switch handle, and there followed a puff, 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 puff. The puffing of the machine assumed a higher key. She was flying along about 8 miles an hour. The ruts in the road were deep, but the machine certainly went with a dream-like smoothness. There was none of the bumping common even to a streetcar. By this time, the boulevard had been reached, and the automobilier, letting a lever fall a little, let her out. Whiz! She picked up speed with infinite rapidity. As she ran on, there was a clattering behind, the new noise of the automobile. For 20 years or more, ever since he'd left his father's farm when he was 16 to get a job in a Detroit machine shop, Henry Ford had been nuts about machinery. First it was watches, then he designed a steam tractor, then he built a horseless carriage with an engine adapted from the auto gas engine he'd read about in World of Science, then a mechanical buggy with a 1-cylinder 4-cycle motor that would run forward but not back. At last, in '98, he felt he was far enough along to risk throwing up his job at the Detroit Edison Company, where he'd worked his way up from night fireman to chief engineer, to put all his time into working on a new gasoline engine. In the late 80s, he'd met Edison at a meeting of electric light employees in Atlantic City. He'd gone up to Edison after Edison had delivered an address and asked him if he thought gasoline was practical as a motor fuel. Edison had said yes. If Edison said it, it was true. Edison was the great admiration of Henry Ford's life. And in driving his mechanical buggy, sitting there at the lever, jauntily dressed in a tight-buttoned jacket and a high collar and a derby hat, back and forth over the level, ill-paved streets of Detroit, scaring the big brewery horses and the skinny trotting horses and the sleek-rumped pacers with the motor's loud explosions, looking for men scatterbrained enough to invest money in a factory for building automobiles. He was the eldest son of an Irish immigrant who during the Civil War had married the daughter of a prosperous Pennsylvania Dutch farmer and settled down to farming near Dearborn in Wayne County, Michigan. Like plenty of other Americans, young Henry grew up hating the endless sogging through the mud about the chores, the hauling and pitching manure, the kerosene lamps to clean, the irk and sweat and solitude of the farm. He was a slender, active youngster, a good skater, clever with his hands. What he liked was to tend the machinery and let the others do the heavy work. His mother had told him not to drink, smoke, gamble, or go into debt, and he never did. When he was in his early 20s, his father tried to get him back from Detroit, where he was working as a mechanic and repairman for the dry dock engine company that built engines for steamboats, by giving him 40 acres of land. Young Henry built himself an up-to-date square white dwelling. Just one second. Built himself an up-to-date square white dwelling house. Built himself an up-to-date white... Young Henry built himself an up-to-date square white dwelling house with a false mansard roof, and married and settled down on the farm. But he let the hired men do the farming. He bought himself a buzzsaw and rented a stationary engine and cut the timber off the woodlots. He was a thrifty young man who never drank or smoked or gambled or coveted his neighbor's wife, but he couldn't stand living on the farm. He moved to Detroit, and in the brick barn behind his house tinkered for years in his spare time with a mechanical buggy that would be light enough to run over the clayey wagon roads of Wayne County, Michigan. By 1900, he had a practicable car to promote. He was 40 years old before the Ford Motor Company was started and production began to move. Speed was the first thing the early automobile manufacturers went after. Races advertised the makes of cars. Henry Ford himself hung up several records at the track at Grosse Pointe and on the ice on Lake St. Clair. In his 999, he did the mile in 39 4/5 seconds. But it has always been his custom to hire others to do the heavy work. The speed he was busy with was speed in production, the records in efficient output. The records were records in efficient output. He hired Barney Oldfield, a stunt bicycle rider from Salt Lake City, to do the racing for him. Henry Ford had ideas about other things than the designing of motors, carburetors, magnetos, jigs and fixtures, punches and dies. He had ideas about sales. The big money was in economical quantity production, quick turnover, cheap, interchangeable, easily replaced, standardized parts. It wasn't until 1909, after years of arguing with his partners, that Ford put out the first Model T. And Henry Ford was right. That season, he sold more than 10,000 Tin Lizzies. 10 years later, he was selling almost 1 million a year. In these years, the Taylor plan was stirring up plant managers and manufacturers all over the country. Efficiency was the word. The same ingenuity that went into improving the performance of a machine could go into improving the performance of the workman producing the machine. In 1913, they established the assembly line at Ford's. That season, the profits were something like $25 million, but they had trouble keeping men on the job. Machinists didn't seem to like it at Ford's. Henry Ford had ideas about other things than production. He was the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. He paid high wages. Maybe if the steady workers thought they were getting a cut, a very small cut, in the profits, it would give trained men an inducement to stick to their jobs. Well-paid workers might save enough money to buy a Tin Lizzie. The first day Ford's announced that clean-cut, properly married American workers who wanted jobs had a chance to make $5 a day. Of course, it turned out that there were strings attached to it. Always there were strings to it. Such an enormous crowd waited outside the Highland Park plant all through the 0 January night that there was a riot when the gates were opened. Cops broke heads, job hunters threw bricks. Henry Ford's own property was destroyed. The company Dix had to turn on the fire hose to beat back the crowd. The American plan, automotive prosperity seeping down from above. It turned out there were strings to it. But that $5 a day paid a good, clean American workman who didn't drink or smoke cigarettes or read or think, and who didn't commit adultery, and whose wives didn't take in boarders, made America once more the Yukon of the sweated workers of the world, made all the Tin Lizzies and the automotive age, and incidentally made Henry Ford the automobilier, the admirer of Edison, the bird lover, the greatest American of his time. Hail victory, brothers. But Henry Ford had ideas about other things besides assembly lines and the living habits of his employees. He was full of ideas. Instead of going to the city to make his fortune, here was a country boy who'd made his fortune by bringing the city out to the farm. The precepts he learned out of McGuffey's Reader, his mother's prejudices and preconceptions, he had preserved clean and unworn as fresh printed bills in the safe of a bank. He wanted people to know about his ideas, so he bought the Dearborn Independent. He bought the Dearborn Independent and started a campaign against cigarette smoking. When war broke out in Europe, he had ideas about that too. Suspicion of army men and soldiering were part of Midwest farm tradition. Like thrift, stickativeness, temperance, and sharp practice in money matters. Any intelligent American mechanic could see that if the Europeans hadn't been a lot of ignorant, underpaid foreigners who drank, smoked, and were loose about women and wasteful in their methods of production, the war never would have happened. When Rosica Schwimmer broke through the stockade of secretaries and servicemen who surrounded Henry Ford and suggested to him that he could stop the war, he said sure, they'd hire a ship and go over and get the boys out of the trenches by Christmas. He hired a steamboat, the Oscar II, and filled it up with pacifists and social workers to go over to explain to the princelings of Europe that what they were doing was vicious and silly. It wasn't his fault that Poor Richard's common sense no longer rules the world and that most of the pacifists were nuts, goofy with headlines. When William Jennings Bryan went over to Hoboken to see him off, somebody handed William Jennings Bryan a squirrel in a cage. William Jennings Bryan made a speech with the squirrel under his arm. Henry Ford threw American Beauty roses to the crowd. The band played, "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." Practical jokers let loose more squirrels. An eloping couple was married by a platoon of ministers in the saloon, and Mr. Zero, the flophouse humanitarian, who reached the dock too late to sail, dove into the North River and swam after the boat. The Oscar II was described as a floating Chautauqua. Henry Ford said it felt like a Middle Western village, but by the time they reached Kristiansand in Norway, the reporters had kidded him so that he had gotten cold feet and gone to bed. The world was too crazy outside of Wayne County, Michigan. Mrs. Ford and the management sent an Episcopal dean after him who brought him home under wraps, and the pacifists had to speechify without him. 2 years later, Ford's was manufacturing munitions, Eagle boats. Henry Ford was planning one-man tanks and one-man submarines, like the one tried out in the Revolutionary War. He announced to the press that he'd turn over his war profits to the government, but there's no record that he ever did. One thing he brought back from his trip was the protocols of the elders of. He started a campaign to enlighten the world in the Dearborn Independent. The tribesmen were why the world wasn't like Wayne County, Michigan, in the old horse and buggy days. The tribesmen had started the war. They had started Bolshevism, Darwinism, Marxism, Nietzsche, short skirts, and lipstick. They were behind Wall Street and international bankers and the white slave traffic and the movies and the Supreme Court and ragtime and the illegal liquor business. Henry Ford denounced the tribesmen and ran for senator and sued the Chicago Tribune for libel and was the laughingstock of the kept metropolitan press. You see what Dos Passos is doing here? He's able to tell us this true history, the stuff that actually occurred. He's able to tell us that Henry Ford was the greatest American of his generation, of his day, okay? He's telling us what he really actually did with the Chicago Tribune. He's telling us all this stuff that's true. Well, almost all of it, right? The Darwinism and lipstick and Nietzsche. I mean, the tribes people didn't have anything to do with that, but the rest of it, it's all true. And I'd encourage you to go read the collected volumes that have been published out of those pieces in the Chicago or in the Dearborn Independent if you haven't done it. It's terribly interesting and it's very, very well written. Gave me a new perspective on a lot of stuff. Anyhow, he was the laughingstock of the kept metropolitan press. What do we have today? What does everybody complain about? This is 1933, writing about stuff that happened in 1920. Nothing ever changes. War never changes. But when the metropolitan bankers tried to horn in on his business, he thoroughly outsmarted them. In 1918, he had borrowed on notes to buy out his minority stockholders for the picayune sum of $25 million. In February 1920, he needed cash to pay off some of these notes that were coming due. A banker is supposed to have called on him and offered him every facility if the banker's representative could be made a member of the board of directors. Henry Ford handed the banker his hat and went about raising the money in his own way. He shipped every car and part he had at his plant to his dealers and demanded immediate cash payment. Let the other fellow do the borrowing had always been a cardinal principle. He shut down production, canceled all orders from the supply firms. Many dealers were ruined, many supply firms failed, but when he reopened his plant, he owned it absolutely, the way a man owns an unmortgaged farm with the taxes paid up. In 1920, there started the Ford boom for president. High wages, water power, industry scattered to the small towns. That was skillfully pricked. This plan was skillfully pricked behind the scenes by another Cracker Barrel philosopher, Calvin Coolidge. But in 1922, Henry Ford sold 1,332,209 Tin Lizzies. He was the richest man in the world. Good roads had followed the narrow ruts made in the mud by the Model T. The great automotive boom was on. At Ford's production was improving all the time. Less waste, more spotters, straw bosses, stool pigeons, 15 minutes for lunch, 3 minutes to go to the toilet. The tailorized speed up everywhere. Reach under, adjust washer, screw down bolt, shove in cotter pin, reach under, adjust washer, screw down bolt, reach under, adjust washer, screw down bolt, under adjust, until every ounce of life was sucked off into production, and at night the working men went home, gray, shaking husks. Ford owned every detail of that's your white privilege, by the way, right? That's your white privilege. Your workmen go home as gray, shaking husks. And the money that they made goes into a house that they can build and pass down to their family. They can buy land with. That's the wealth of the white middle class in America. It was built off of men like this who went home as gray, shaking husks. Ford owned every detail of the process from the ore in the hills until the car rolled off the end of the assembly line under its own power. The plants were rationalized to the last 10,000th of an inch as measured by the Johansen scale. In 1926, the production cycle was reduced to 81 hours from the ore in the mine to the finished saleable car proceeding under its own power. But the Model T was obsolete. New era prosperity in the American plan. There were strings to it. There were always strings to it. Had killed Tin Lizzie. Ford's was just one of many automobile plants when the stock market bubble burst. Mr. Ford, the Cracker Barrel philosopher, said jubilantly, "I told you so. Serves you right for gambling and getting in debt." The country is sound. But when the country, on cracked shoes and frayed trousers, belts tightened over hollow bellies, idled hands, cracked and chapped with the cold of that coldest March day of 1932, started marching from Detroit to Dearborn, asking for work and the American plan, all they could think of at Ford's was machine guns. The country was sound, but they mowed the marchers down. They shot 4 of them dead. Henry Ford, as an old man, is a passionate antiquarian. lives besieged on his father's farm, embedded in an estate of thousands of millionaire acres, protected by an army of servicemen, secretaries, secret agents, dicks under orders of an English ex-prize fighter, always afraid of the feet and broken shoes on the roads, afraid the gangs will kidnap his grandchildren, Lindbergh, that a crank will shoot him, that change and the idle hands out of work will break through the gates and the high fences, protected by a private army, against the new America of starved children and hollow bellies and cracked shoes stamping on soup lines, that has swallowed up the old thrifty farmlands of Wayne County, Michigan, as if they had never been. Henry Ford, as an old man, is a passionate antiquarian. He rebuilt his father's farmhouse and put it back exactly in the state he remembered it as a boy. He built a village of museums for buggies, sleighs, coaches, old plows, water wheels, obsolete models of motor cars. He scoured the country for fiddlers to play old-fashioned square dances. Even old taverns he bought and put back in their original shape, as well as Thomas Edison's early laboratories. When he bought the Wayside Inn near Sudbury, Massachusetts, he had the new highway where the new model cars roared and slithered and hissed oilily past, the new noise of the automobile. Moved away from the door and put back the old bad road so that everything might be the way it used to be in the days of horse and buggies. I hope you've enjoyed our time together, reading these selections from the excellent novels of John Dos Passos. A view of, I think, one of our guys on an America that has been gone for a long time. Henry Ford in the 1930s, after the stock market crash, was already looking for an America that had gone. And so now, 90 years later, how far are we from that? Thank you.